And then the last thing on this whole volume, it's interesting to see as you've done, and again, I don't know how it compared to previous off seasons that you've done, but I know talking with Steve Hall these days versus a couple of years ago, he's backed off on volume a bit. Brian Borstein now he's really cut back volume dramatically. Like he's almost back to like max OT type training. Jeffrey Schofield, who was known for like crazy high volumes, is now more just like normal high volumes and has talked about, just focusing on like doing it correctly and the intensity and all that. And and honestly, I can't tell you how many clients I've trained where they're like, "Is this all we're doing?" And I'm like, "This is at least where we're starting. I'm dropping you back." And for one reason, there's a lot of different reasons you could say why they get more progress at that point, but we see that a lot. Whereas in your case, you're obviously doing a lot of it. So you kind of already touched on like takeaways, but I guess just for people listening, do you think that they who do you think should be experimenting with higher volumes, whether it's 20 to 30 sets per body part per week, which is obviously not doable for a lot of people, but just in general, because I do think I'm almost surprised at the number of people who are even at an advanced stage who cut back and say, wow, this is actually really great.
I think a very common thing that happens, and I saw this as a coach repeatedly, and I see this in a lot of people when doing a lot of volume is very popular, is that either purposefully or inadvertently, the higher volume someone does, the more they start pacing themselves. And this is a very, very natural thing. And there's even research on showing like people, they don't perform as well across multiple sets when like they have open-ended rep counts and stuff like that. It is a very, very biologically logical thing to do to gauge and estimate the total amount of energy output you need to do, and then to figure out the best way to have like an average, performance across it.
Yeah.
Even though that's not the way you stimulate muscle growth, is you're trying to like if we were going to characterize volume as training dose, like if the stimulus is high threshold motor unit recruitment, actually seeing involuntary slowing of rep speed or lifting heavy enough so that rep speed is slow, so you're getting high levels of mechanical tension. Um, if that is the stimulus, and then we need to manipulate the dose, it is not an increase in dose if by turning up the volume, it changes the proximity to failure or quality of the movement, or even sometimes the exercise selection, or the rest periods, or all these other things that happen. Because what you invariably see when someone tries to, not invariably, what I often see when someone tries to do high volume is exercises with longer setups, exercises that beat them up a little more, and those start changing. They make different choices on what exercises they'll do, and proximity to failure starts to drift higher. And the quality of movement typically gets worse as they're just trying to tick boxes and get through the volume. Because when most people go on a high volume protocol, it's because they've been exposed to some content about it. They're not thinking about it really in a kind of deep way. And therefore they want to do that. And the thing they're focused on is not executing the training well, it's completing the volume, because that's the thing that convinced them to do high volume. Right. So it's
Hmm.
it's the classic magic trick, like I've got a rabbit out of the hat, but where did that rabbit come from? It was my other hands that I misdirected you with as the magician. So when high volume studies are done, you have people around you motivating you and making sure that you go to failure or the RIR that they have trained you to go at. And it lasts for 2 to 3 months on average, and 80% of the studies on high volume are also studies to failure, and I think people forget that. So we had the phase of time where volume was being emphasized to the point where people are going, well, we're going to have to drop the RIR if we want to do this high volume,
Hmm.
which is a misinterpretation of the data. The data says, yeah, if you do 6 sets to failure, that's great. It's going to produce a good amount of hypertrophy. And if you do 12 sets, you get even more. And then if you do 18 sets in some studies, you get a little bit more. And if we have big enough meta regression, we can actually see that signal in the noise, but some studies won't show it. And it's this marginal return on investment. But in practice, people are not just manipulating one variable. You turn volume up in exercise selection, rest periods, even the target muscle, depending upon how much their quality of movement changes, and proximity to failure most often is what is adjusted. And I think it's really important. One of the things that not as many people have talked about with like the recent Pelin meta regression is not just the diminishing dose response, but also just understanding the nature of the relationship between sets and hypertrophy. So statistically, you can describe how much of the variance between two variables are predicted by one another. So when you square the R value and just a simple linear correlation, most people are probably familiar with like correlations, like, oh, height and weight, they're probably like correlated at zero point 0.6 or zero point 0.7. And if you square those values, that's, 36 or 49, right? So that means that you can explain up to maybe 50% if it's a zero point 0.7 correlation, 49% of the change in height by weight. Because it's not all of it, but generally taller people weigh more. But you can also take a tall person and have them diet or eat a lot, and they're going to change their weight as well, but still be the same height. And when we look at the relationship between sets per week and hypertrophy, the explained variance is like 25%. So that's not nothing. That matters, right?
Yeah.
But that also means that 75% of everything else that explains hypertrophy is not volume. So in my mind, it really doesn't make sense to increase volume if it decreases literally anything else that could be associated with hypertrophy. So if an increase in volume results in poor exercise selection, being further from failure, not performing exercises in such a way that targets and stimulates the muscle that you're intending, and reduces your intentionality and your focus, and even the loads are coming down because you're just solely focused on volume. Absolutely, I could see, and I have seen, and I've done it for other people, lowering their volume, resulting in an increase in hypertrophy because they're doing all those other things properly.
Hmm.
And I think that is the most practical thing that I can give people when it comes to volume is your sweet spot is going to be when volume is able to go up without detracting from these other factors. And I think it also extends outside of the gym as well. Some people, when they do really high volume training, it takes more time, right? So if it's creating stress outside of your life, if it requires you to change your sleep schedule, if it forces work and social life out of your time schedule to some degree and it creates interpersonal conflict, or you're just not enjoying training anymore because it feels like a slog and this checklist. I think all of those things are in many cases not worth it. So when I consider increasing volume for someone, the first thing I do is I make sure they have everything in place for their recovery environment. And the second thing I do is I really reiterate those points to them. And then we do it incrementally. And I like to see videos of their training so that I can see when we went from 10 sets to 14 sets, it didn't result in, 10 high quality sets turning to 14 sets, because I think that could be neutral or even potentially negative. So for me, I am going in eyes wide open and I am constantly checking. I don't need to post my training videos on my Instagram. David, like that's not what's like driving my growth is the
Sure.
story of me doing,
Right.
some stupid like press, right? Um, and certainly my once a month 3DMJ YouTube vlog where I put up my videos is not necessarily driving my growth. It's not something that I think is critically important. But I put myself out there and tell people, hey, I'm training at a 0 to 2 RIR and hitting failure on isolation movements. And if it like and I ask a lot like I send training videos to my coaches. I train with a workout partner. I'm in front of other people. And I'm videotape my sets not because I'm trying to make content, but because I want to look at it and go, yep, that was the RIR I thought it was. And I'm going to put it online, because I know that it'll come back to me. It'll be the Eric doesn't train hard thing. And I'm go, okay, so I'm doing 30 sets and they're trash. Like I need to
Hmm.
dial it back.
Yeah, yeah.
That hasn't happened. So each time I have increased my volume, it's my best attempt at actually turning up the dose, but also still understanding that as I go from 20 to 30 sets, it is probably, you know, as effective as going from like 4 to 10 because
Yeah.
of that diminishing returns. And for most people, that is simply not worth it for what the cost is and the effort. But for me, because I have repeatedly seen that I respond to it each time I try low volume. Because I've literally done max OT.
Yeah.
I have literally done HIT. I have literally trained with Jeff Alberts, who taught me how to do it. I started training in my first protocol. Everything was forced reps. And like I remember when my buddy Adam, like we would talk about when one of us had to go on leave, or if we got deployed, he was in the Army, I was in the Air Force, and we couldn't train together, or one of us was away. Like, how am I going to train hard? Like, I can't do forced reps. Like that was just our mentality, what we thought we had to do for our first couple of years of training. was going past failure. So, and I did a PhD on RIR and RPE. So for me, I find it is really, really intuitive when I can tell that my training quality changes, and it really makes sense. Like I've never bought into, and I think it's a really, really dumb way of positioning volume versus intensity. I see one as the dose of the other. And I think that is a really important perspective for people to have if they want to understand the volume data. It's trying to find the right dose. And again, I'm repeating myself, but if you change the dose, that means you need to not be changing the other thing. And if they both change, you're not changing the dose.
Yeah.
And the dose is not everything. So anyway, I am able to it makes sense for my goal of where I'm trying to make an improvement. I'm not trying to find the best way for me to train for 10 years. Right now, I'm trying to train to make as much possible progress as I think is available biologically and in my time constraints before I get on stage in 10 months,
Yeah.
right? So, am I doing more volume than quote unquote necessary? Well, what's the definition of necessary? If it's to make any gains, yeah, I'm probably doing literally twice as much as I would need to do to be making some type of incremental marginal gains. And that could be evaluated as dumb, and somewhere between that would be a good decision. But ultimately, it's a good move in my shoes if I am not sacrificing anything for that, and if I'm enjoying it, if I'm not getting injured. Another way to look at this is, okay, maybe you can turn up the dose and you can maintain the quality and all the things I talked about, but you have to deload every 3 weeks, or you're getting hurt every other block. And the time off or the time away from effective training is ultimately you look at the area under the curve and it's less. The more and more and more I understand the mechanisms of what's involved, and I look at the research and I think about coaching in my own career and history as a lifter, basically hypertrophy training is trying to do as much as you can for as long as you can, as effectively as you can, as frequently as you can. And recognizing that when you try to do that, the recovery on the other side of it is the response,
Hmm.
and you should be seeing some type of progress. So you auto regulate and you check back in based upon the output. But that's all it is. So it's trying to find the most efficient way to do as much as possible. And efficiency means something different as well. And someone in my shoes, I am willing to make a 30% increase in volume to get a 1% improvement that I won't even be able to measure, just hypothetically, if I'm not seeing any negative signs. But that's a bad decision if you're like, hey, I'm a busy person, but still serious about my goals. You should probably be doing 5 to 15 sets, right? If you have 3 hours to give in a week, then take all the stuff that we said earlier in this podcast about time efficiency, bust your ass, train to failure, and do it in those 3 hours. And you'll probably only be able to get, somewhere between 5 to 15 sets. And each one of those sets is going to be critically important and produce a large, return on investment. And I'm doing twice that amount to maybe only get 20 or 30% more. And that seems really stupid if you're like an investor.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if I have to be on stage naked against the best bodybuilders in the world, I want to get that small marginal improvement for the time investment because I'm competing.
For sure. Yeah. And if you're not standing there naked next to other guys, I mean, what are you really doing, Eric?
Like it is life even life if you're not doing that, right?
Real quick before the last topic, it made me think about something. So when I was getting into the rest pause stuff, again, like mostly through DC training, and he would advocate each of your 3 sets should be like all out to failure, zero RER, pushing as hard as you can. And eventually, so let's just use an example. Let's say you're doing dumbbell curls, 50 pounds for 12. You rest a little bit, you get four. You rest a little bit, you get three. Now, again, in his protocol, you're resting 15 to 20 breaths, which in my experience is more like 45 seconds. So they really just started to get like three individual sets almost. But anyway, I started getting to a point where I was like, well, we know accomplishing more volume, or at least we're told accomplishing more volume gets you more results. And if I avoid going to failure on the first set and keep it as a 2 RAR and then maybe a 1 RAR on my second set, then I will clearly get more net volume, is how I started to think about it. So I was like, okay, cool. So I'll actually save a little bit but again, that was kind of antithetical to his approach of like hardest on every single set. So again, I was kind of like, well, I'm getting more volume. However, based on the conversation you and I are having right now, I'm almost wondering if you would then say, actually, Dave, you were thinking about it incorrectly because even though in that session you got more volume by going less intense across the three sets, over time, you would have less of a response and less hypertrophy and gains. What do you think of that?
There's an interaction effect here of like, if we think about it from an effective reps perspective, would it been have been a little bit better if it was like rest just a little bit longer so that instead of getting, a 10-4-3 or whatever the example you gave was, you got like 10-6-4. Like I would guess that would be a little bit better, because we know that sets of 3 to 5 RM are slightly less effective, or 2 to 4 RM. I think we have clearer data on that. Like I think like the bottom ceiling, the floor, that's the way that works in houses. So the floor of how long does a set to failure or near failure need to be for it to be on equal footing to another set of higher reps is probably around 4 to 5 reps, right? Does that translate to drop sets, rest pause? I think it probably does. Because if we think about how you're getting there, it's different. One, you're being limited on how much work you can do because of fatigue. The other one, you're being limited on how quickly can you meet the ATP demands of a very high force requirement, right? So, like if I'm doing a set of 5, we know that I'm recruiting everything, and the only difference between like a set of 8 and a set of 4 is probably a faster firing frequency, but everything's getting recruited, it's getting exposed to tension. And when you do a rest pause set, you're getting there, just like that BFR example I gave earlier, by front loading some fatigue so that you're having to bring more motor units from the pool, and the other ones are already fatigued, right? So there is a point where that fatigue is debilitative, and there is a point where that fatigue is facilitative. When we see really too short of rest intervals and we start to see these compounding effects and central fatigue, we're just not doing enough work, and we're hitting fatigue, but we're actually not recruiting all of those motor units. So to some degree, we don't know where that sweet spot is. And that's why it's challenging to have this conversation. If you were to lighten the load and get more reps per set, fewer of those reps would count, right? At the heavy load with a short rest interval, you're not getting as many reps. So even though there's not those uncounted reps, everything does count, but there's not that much of it. So it's probably somewhere in the middle where you could get there by staying at a 1 RIR and getting a little bit more volume. And maybe you're getting a little more stimulus for slightly less, a little less stimulus, but for slightly more reps. And the net aggregate is maybe 5% higher. But it's almost impossible to gauge. And the differences we're talking about are probably really small. So kind of the general heuristic I like to use is that your drop sets and your rest pause sets should probably at least get you 4 to 5 reps. And if they're not at least getting you 4 to 5 reps on each one of those drops, and this I could be wrong, by the way, because you're not recruiting the whole motor unit pool, I don't know, then you either need to rest longer, drop more, or not go as close to failure on the prior set. And I trend towards still going to failure because when you're generating all this fatigue and you're feeling that local burn, you're probably not as good at gauging actual proximity to failure. So I like to use moderate to high reps. So we're talking on that first activation set, 10 to 20, and then dropping or rest pausing from there sufficiently to make sure that I'm at least getting 4 to 5 reps, and then going to failure on each one of those. And that is where I have the most confidence that those are relatively equivalent. And I still only count them as like 0.75 of all the total sets to what they would be.
So you'd be
Um,
pretty against myo reps, I would think then, right? Because aren't most myo rep drops getting you to like 2 to 4 reps on the subsequent sets after the first one?
I mean, not really because, well, it depends. It depends on how you implement it. Like if you use rest pause or myo reps, and they're very similar, rest pause is just typically done to failure. Um, and you end up what you try to do is match the volume. And if you match the volume of 3 straight sets, it's if anything, it's a higher stimulus
Yeah.
because everything is in a fatigue state. But once you start doing myo reps or rest pause to achieve, say, two-thirds or half the volume, but you go, oh, but they're all effective. I'm like, I don't know where that line in the sand is.
Yeah.
So
I was just asking because I know for
it's tough.
me, I drop off a lot. So like on like an incline dumbbell row, I'll get like 18, 8, 6. So I have to start with pretty light weight to stay above
Mm.
a 5 rep. If I did anything like a quote unquote normal work set of like 12, I'm definitely going down to like 5 and 3 or something. And that's with a 45-second rest. So, but I mean, obviously that's going to be individual as well. So,
I also almost exclusively do, not exclusively, I primarily do drop sets and rest pause stuff on single joint movements.
oh, interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Cool. All right. So, last topic here today. We want to give people no grace on this. We've seen a fight against science-based lifting, and we're taking it to heart. No, but really, I think we have seen in the last, I don't know. I will say, for a little while there, it just the whole science-based anything became kind of clickbaity, right? And it's like, do this with science and do that. And it was just kind of like just to get clicks and views, and that's, I guess, fine depending on what you're going for. But I think a lot of that is obviously this misinterpretation of what that means. And actually, I saw a video by Jeff Nipper that I liked where he said, the average person would think that this is what I meant with science-based lifting, but it's actually not. This is just like what you're assuming based on this idea of science-based lifting, which is just really inaccurate. And so that's, I think, initially how we actually got talking about this podcast. Was we've seen, I had Atlas Power Shrugged on recently, and he was very, going hard against certain science-based educators and whatnot. A few other people as well. So that's very broad, but maybe as somebody who is probably maybe one of the most well-known science-based advocates for bodybuilding, maybe you can kind of discuss some of the errors people are making when they're kind of lashing out against it.
Yeah, and there's onus on both sides, right? Like, I think the biggest issue is that there's something that people want science to be, and there's even something that people who are attracted to science think it is, that it's not. And that comes down to the understanding that science, human research specifically, not engineering, not a lot of the other STEM things where we can really rule out a lot of variables and see very reliable outcomes. Theoretical physics, things like that. Anything that's math, just pure math, rather than statistics, which is math, but it's probabilistic. People really struggle thinking in probabilities. So in my experience, most people who are attracted to science and want to use science to inform their lifting is they like certainty. That's it. They love when there is a black and white answer, even when they philosophically understand that that's not really the way things work and everything we talked about earlier in this podcast and the interaction of psychology, environment, and sociology. They still want it to be like, okay, but what's better, 15 sets or 10, And it's not that they don't like context, it's like they like certainty. So they approach things in certain ways that lends itself towards misinterpreting research. You get that among researchers who got into science that way. And while they're giving correct information, they present it without enough caveats. And then that is reinforced by the type of content that does well on social media, where it's short form and confidence and controversy, which are controversial and confident because they don't need context. They remove the context so they can give you the soundbite. That's what gets favored. And there is onus on both sides, right? I think another thing that is just going on in society generally is there's been a general mistrust of science and authority and public figures, and kind of the idea that you need to be skeptical, which I love, but skepticism from a place of ignorance and Dunning-Kruger and not knowing it. So, I think when you had Atlas Power Shrugged on, you were asking him like, what did he see was wrong with some of the research? And I think this is true of a lot of people. It's not a critique of him, but he was like, well, there's, these researchers not doing double blind studies. And I'm like, how do you do a double blind study in exercise science? Like, okay, you're going to be in the 40 set group. Don't count them though, right?
Right.
How many have you done? I have no idea. I'm blinded to this protocol, right? So, um, Or talking about how like order effects aren't accounted for in crossovers. And I literally don't know how that's like the easiest thing to account for ever. If you do a crossover, you just randomize which one they do first, then you have a washout, and that's done all of the time. So there is a certain element of, and someone who stated that they dropped out of a master's degree program, but learned a little bit about, study design. They took a class that they may or may not have finished on how does research work. It's exactly the Dunning-Kruger effect where you learn a little bit, and that's helpful. I'm not advocating, just don't have any comments about
Yeah.
research. Just let the researchers do it. Trust us. That's not what I'm advocating for, but I think you just have to be really aware that if you know a little bit about how you think something's supposed to operate, but you're actually missing some really big pieces of information, the messaging can be, well, oh, we need to throw out all the science, and you're just missing out on a lot of information, right? And the whole idea of advocating for like real world results and what's going on, it's just us feeding into our own cognitive biases. Like when we see an example online of an individual who gets results doing something, I tell you what, my emotional reaction is that that is more reliable than a meta regression on 1,000 people. I think that's true of all of us. That's our ape brain. I've seen it. They were doing this before, it didn't work. They did this, now it worked. It's real. This
Mhm.
meta regression, dots on a graph, like I don't know, whatever. How do I trust this science? I'm like, what do you mean? How do you trust 1,000 people's results? If you actually took that same person to the lab, had them sit there as a research assistant, watch the pre-post measurements and see like, oh shit, I guess in most cases high volume does produce in these real people. That guy's name is George. Like this N of one thing that they see on YouTube feels more real. It feels like
Yeah.
it's in the trenches and science is somewhere else. But for the scientists and the research participants and the people who've been a part of it, that N of one experience you get watching that YouTube, we've had with an N of 20 that we looked at and saw in real life. So I think there's this disconnect there because we're not great at communicating how to interpret science, and science is not done in an effective way for non-scientists to understand, even unfortunately in something like exercise science. And the algorithm and the mechanisms by which science is communicated on social media reward shorter form confident speech, which is challenging. So in my mind, I think a really, really important thing that needs to be done is that you can't just purely follow what does the algorithm reward. You have to sprinkle in philosophy of science and interpretation along the way so that your audience is ready to understand. Because there's a lot of current well-meaning, effective communicators in terms of growing a platform. They're reaching a lot of people who are finding who they're complaining currently about being misconstrued, misinterpreted, and how what they are saying is being strawmanned. And I think that's true, but I think you have to understand how things are going to be taken. They will be taken out of context if you don't explicitly provide the context. And
Sure.
I think that is a hard thing to do and grow. So there's a reason why I won't talk about it is true that I think on average, if someone does 30 sets versus 10, they will get more hypertrophy. But you'll never just hear me say that in a 10-second clip because I understand how it can be misconstrued, right? I'll never just say going to failure is better than being at a 2 RIR on average without context because it'll be misconstrued and I have to deal with that. And other people have to deal with it. And it pisses people off. And then it comes into camps. And then it becomes a I told you so thing. And an ego gets involved. And we just get further away from what is accurate. And I don't know that I do it the right way, but I know that I have substantially reduced the number of times that I get misconstrued by communicating the way I do. The cost is that me doing a short reel, as I've been doing lately, is that they
Mhm.
are 3-minute videos, not 30 seconds. And they get 1,500 to 2,000 likes rather than probably twice that amount if I did it shorter,
Yeah.
and that I'm growing slower. But I'm still growing. Um, and I think if we lose the trust of people, then it defeats our purpose. But I'm not sure we are losing the trust of most people. That's the thing. It's like you have people like Jeremy Ethier, you have people like Jeff Nippard, you have these YouTube channels growing really, really fast, and people are using science as marketing, and it's become very trendy, and it's pissing people off, and it's kind of like, you got all the underground hip hop heads who are like, oh, what the fuck is this commercial rap,
Yeah.
But
Right.
that also tells me that commercial rap is exploding, right? And ultimately, I'm not sure it's a bad thing that you can have a quote unquote science-based channel and have millions of followers. I think that's probably a better position than we were in 20 years ago when the content that was most popular was really bad and manipulative and probably applied in like all the advice for a lifter like you and me 20 years ago was probably only appropriate for a super heavyweight multiply geared power lifter
Right, right.
who's enhanced or an IFBB pro, you know? And it's just different now. And most of the content for women was, God, even worse
Yeah,
and in
yeah.
very different ways. So I think the overall IQ is higher. I think the overall content is better. But I think for people who are like your lifter's lifter and they saw and they remember when there was fewer evidence-based content creators and they were much more nuanced and they were struggling to be even nearly the same size, they're not comfortable with the concessions that are being made by certain content creators. And they think it's doing more harm than good. And I don't know if they're wrong or right, but I can tell you that the wrong reaction, in my opinion, and a net negative, is to attack the entire concept of science-based lifting because of how it's communicated by some people, and leaning into the idea that exercise science is just being done poorly because there's someone on YouTube you don't like who's talking about it, when there are literally tens of thousands of universities and labs doing 1,000 studies that are published a month, and you're looking at someone's representation of 0.1% of that, and you're going, well, let's ditch the whole thing.
Yeah,
And again, each one of these studies has 20 to 30 real people in it who have those same experiences you're seeing online, but your emotional brain, your lizard brain that we all have, your human brain is telling me, well, that one's real, and that stuff's, in a file drawer or on a PubMed, or it's not the same, but it is. And
yeah,
it's just 20 times that amount of evidence.
yeah. Yeah, well, let me, as a scientist, let me comment. And I say that because I had an email this morning from ResearchGate. David, a recent article cited your research. New article in Nature, unveiling whole body vibration squat intensity insight from oxygen consumption and heart rate response. So, just FYI, if anybody wants to see some esteemed research. So, Aaron,
Welcome to the elite club. I did not know you did a vibration plate based research, Dr. McConaughey.
oh yes, 2013, yes, sir.
Let's
Yeah, that was
go.
with Radimus. You know our boy Radimus.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We all know each other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. He's a big dog. I mean, I don't know what he does now, but like when I knew him, I mean,
No,
we would chat.
he's a legend. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, I don't even just mean from a research standpoint. I mean, like literally, he would, bench over 400 pounds, deadlift like 675. Like he was a big dog.
There's a surprising number of that's another thing that I know I've talked about this before, but the amount of times this is starting to go away. The idea that lifters are just pencil necks. I'm sorry, like sports science researchers just pencil necks who don't do anything. Now it's just we're idiots who don't know what we're doing,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
we do lift. But it's only like a year or two ago, the goalpost was like, oh, these people don't lift, and it's like, hold on. So people who've dedicated their life to researching hypertrophy probably don't lift, or maybe they're obsessed with it. Oops, it was the latter. All right, let's change the narrative. They're just dumb, but yeah, they lift, but it's the wrong way, and
yeah,
they don't know how to get good gains. So you can't trust their research. That's the new kind of take on that. But it wasn't too long ago that the same people were critiquing scientists as having no real world experience.
sure.
So
Yeah, no, he definitely walked the walk, and also, Feigenbaum, he does with like children exercise and
mhm.
whatnot. He's big too, or at least again, I don't know now, but when I was in college, he was probably 50, and he was bigger than most of the athletes then. So definitely plenty of people did. Cool. So, what I was going to say on that is, as somebody who I talked to a lot of people like you and other people who have done a lot of research, but also people who are like practical and whatnot. I think you started it by saying the onus is on both sides, and I
Yes.
think that I can understand it because, like, for instance, somebody like Alex Bromley, who I like a lot. Actually, I've had him on the podcast a couple of times. We've had some good conversations, and he'd call out certain people. And obviously, like I say this as somebody who watches occasional videos, but I definitely do not know all the videos out there or the disputes and debates people are having. So this is just with like limited context. I do see where some of the frustration could come in, where you get a quote unquote science-based person saying like, "This is why your biceps aren't growing," and it's like, "Hey, in this
Mhm.
recent study, they saw superior results by doing this extra lengthened, whatever. And in reality, it was like, yes, it was a little bit superior, but it was like 10% and it was short term and this. And you're making this video that's like, this is why you're not growing. And I totally understand it because I understand why they do that because they get way more clicks, they get way more growth. This is how they make money. I do understand that. But I can also totally understand the frustration from the other side of like, man, you are frankly kind of misleading people. And earlier
Yes.
you said, Eric, you said in terms of like the volume, you would not recommend anybody do more volume if it meant it took away from almost any of these other variables, right? And I would say that I would not recommend anybody do what the cliche science-based lifting is, again, just from the cliche, maybe like misnomer of it, if it meant that they're taking away from their intensity and their general effort and some of these other things. And that's why I think, sure, maybe like the barbell row isn't the best back exercise. But if you're like, 2005 IFBB Pro T Nation, let's go, just going hard with everything, but you're doing barbell rows, I'm going to put my money on that person 9 or 10 out of 10 times than the person who's like, okay, well, I do want to have this like really lengthened emphasized row, but like nothing else is in order. And again, I know you wouldn't obviously advocate for the latter there, but I do understand where that can come in. And there's this frustration that it's like, hey, like that is not the most important thing. It's a little bit, maybe it's a little bit better, but you're missing out on so much other stuff.
Yeah, it's the context that's missing, right? Like the typical tier list is interpreted differently than it's probably intended if I'm being charitable. Like the assumption is, okay, if everything else stays the same and nothing is taken away, and we compare exercises not for overall development, time efficiency, access, but just which one is going to get you more lat growth, then yeah, I think this exercise is better than that one. But like if you were to ask me, hey, I'm getting serious about training and I've got strength and hypertrophy goals, what are some good exercises? I'm not going to be like, well, the overhead press is not as effective as a cable lateral raise for the middle deltoid, and you're probably getting enough anterior delt work from all your other pressing and flies. I'm going to be like, overhead press, some kind of horizontal press, a pull and a row. Do they have the stomach and the desire to do deadlifts and all the glute and ham work, or are they your typical bro and dude? Yeah, do some bent over barbell rows so you actually have to stabilize your core and you're, actually getting some full body training when it comes to efficiency of doing a lot of things at once for multiple goals, which describes most people who are interested in lifting, then yeah, like overhead press, squat, deadlift, bent over barbell row are your best bangs for the buck. But that's not necessarily who those tier lists are made for, nor the question they're asking. And the issue is that those little things aren't being communicated effectively. And sometimes they simply can't be in the type of short form content we're talking about. Or sometimes it's just that the people watching are, of course, assuming that everyone has the same goals they do, or they see it the same way. That's one little microcosm. But I think a bigger issue is we we have a content treadmill that you have to put out there if you want to be relevant. And research is coming out constantly, and there's certain things that are hot. And as it feels like you're getting whiplash if you're watching this as a viewer, like literally just recently, a new study came out where 100 degrees of hip flexion on a leg press versus full range didn't produce a difference in quad growth. And I see all the comments, long muscle length in shambles.
Mhm.
And then just right after that, though, lying back on a leg extension gets published, and you get better leg growth in the rectus femoris because it's stretched. Oh, okay, we're good to go again. Oh, and then the other study, Schneider comes out. Oh man, the biggest sample on lengthened partials. No significant difference in these trained lifters. Long muscle lengths in shambles. And then another study just comes out, literally 2 days ago, as we record this, where they're comparing incline curls to preacher curls, and very predictably, preacher curls. give you more brachialis growth because it's a monoarticular muscle that's not stretched when you're in shoulder extension, while incline curls gives you more bicep growth. Oh, okay. Long muscle lengths are back on the table. And there again, onus on both sides. The science communicator's job is to help you understand something like the concept of sampling variance, right? If we took every single person who lifts in the entire world, and that's the population that we care about, I don't know, 900 million people. What do you think, Dave? Like it's a lot,
Yeah,
right?
a lot of people.
We can't do a study on 900 million people. We can do a bunch of studies on 20 of them though, and then over a period of 10 years we can look up and some enterprising fellow like, the data-driven strength guys can do a 3,000 person, meta regression or a 1,000 person meta regression on hypertrophy and volume or strength and RIR. And now we actually have precision on how the population with the high level of probability responds to this generally. So talking shit about these 10 person or 20 person studies is missing the point that once we rack up enough of those, we're actually getting some pretty good pictures now 10 years later from the era where we were, looking at every single study that was relevant to lifting as this gem, this piece of gold in a pile of trash of most research not applying to it.
Sure.
But that's not what's happening. Like typically the science-based influencer person who we're critiquing and maybe is the straw man meme of what evidence-based lifting is giving you that whiplash. Oh, new study says this. What should we do? What they really need to be doing is saying, hey, we've got 40 studies now on the general topic of whether or not being at a longer muscle length for most muscles seems to produce greater hypertrophy. About half of them show no difference. We've never seen a study that's found a significant difference for training at a short muscle length. And then the rest of them actually show a small positive effect. So there's definitely some signal in the noise here. This is a real thing, but it's also not going to make a huge difference. Guess what? Another recent study that got published, dumbbell lateral raises, same amount of hypertrophy as cable lateral raises. Oh
Mm,
no, long muscle length in shambles? No, stop it. Sampling variance. We need 5 of those studies before I can actually confidently say something about those 2 specific movements. But I can tell you that that's one little drop in the bucket of me trying to see whether or not there is a beneficial effect of longer muscle lengths versus shorter muscle lengths. And I'm still very convinced that on average, if you can produce a challenge at a longer muscle length and everything else is equal, you're going to get slightly greater hypertrophy, right? But that's not how it's communicated. Each individual study is interpreted, and it's a win for one camp or the other, or for people who don't have a camp, just confusing. Because last week you told me this week you tell me this. Oh, was that a lie? And a lot of, unfortunately, science communicators and researchers themselves, they don't have stats chops. They know how to conduct good studies, but they'll look at 5 studies and they'll look methodically through the methods to try to figure out why did this outcome happen. Sometimes they're right. If there are glaring issues with the methods that did actually create a bias towards one outcome or the other that doesn't have ecological validity to apply to the real world, that's real. But also, we have to realize that if you create a random data set and because you did it, like I in R, I make a data set of, okay, we have a small positive effect that we observe in 900 million people, maybe not that many, but let's say 10,000. And then I simulate with random samples from those 10,000 people, 10 studies that only have 10 to 20 participants. I'm going to have 3 studies that, for completely random reasons, not completely random, but reasons outside of what was manipulated in the study, produce an opposite effect to what was observed, right? If we know that to be the case, that you'll have 3 out of 7 studies, and that we also can't predict when those 3 are going to get published, and it's not a huge probability that they could two false positives or false negatives could come out before all the other studies that are more representative are out there. And now with the content cycle is what it is, you know what? Long muscle lengths are bullshit. We got 2 studies in a row, 2 different lab groups, no significant effect. Everything after that, I'm not paying attention to because it's no longer hot. And then when the meta regression does come out, it's jarring to people, right? So something as simple, it's not simple. Something as important as sampling variance that is not sexy. It requires a longer conversation. We're already more than an hour into a podcast before we're even talking about it, is a critical thing that you actually have to get people to understand so that they don't have this experience. I honestly think that if most people understood sampling variance, that this whole issue would be maybe one tenth the explosivity and the divisive nature that it is. If
Sure.
you knew that with the nature of exercise science, that 20% of all studies are going to give you a incorrect finding, you would just be like, okay, cool. Well, I need to wait until we have three or four more on this before I'm starting to get a hint of how this is going to go, period.
Sure.
But if the content creators jump on the new study that comes out because they got to put something out, and that you have to get through 10 minutes and a very evocative thumbnail and title before you get to them, and you don't even listen to or watch that part, and then they get criticized and they go, well, I freaking said that this, like I said what Eric said. Why are you adding me, Eric? Like, yeah, you did it at the end of a 10-minute YouTube video, which half of your audience only watched 3 minutes of.
Right.
And your title and your image, like you, I know you think you don't want to bury the lead, but there's no way around it that if we want to have people really accurately understand this, you have to have more context in there, and you have to front load some of the caveats, and you have to take the hit, or like you have to take the hit on engagement, period, or you have to accept that you will be misunderstood, you'll be misconstrued, and that you will be sacrificing some things. And maybe you believe that that's worth it if you reach 10,000 more people. And I don't know the answer to that, but I just think you are not allowed to complain. Okay, I'm being mean. If you're going to complain about being misrepresented, you have to understand to some degree you have onus on that and that you're signing up for that, or at least your content seems to be producing that regularly. And that's not all just these extraneous factors and people coming at you. There's a reason that that's occurring. And I'm not trying to victim blame. I do think a lot of the good science communicators right now are being misrepresented and they're being lumped together as here's the bad science. But I think there are things that they could do that would reduce that a lot. It may be too late now that it's been branded a certain way, which sucks.
Right.
But I think that is kind of why we're at where we're at.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think I can add much to that. I think that's totally on point. Um, I think that it doesn't have to be such a dichotomy, of course, between like science-based lifters and like, this other group. But I think that a lot of it is more a superficial view of the camps that there are even camps to begin with. I don't think it has
Mhm.
to be like that. But I think that if you are trying to be logical about it's very clear to see that like you can take what the research says, try to implement it, and going back to the whole conversation we had earlier on like volume, like just because this study showed this on this group on aggregate doesn't mean that it's going to apply to you. And like obviously many examples of that. But like I said, I know I wanted to get you among all people to at least comment on this because obviously you're
Mhm.
very in the trenches. You're, a WNBF pro. You're going to be making huge strides on stage, and
I hope so.
yeah, man. Yeah, I was listening to your last update there, and it's cool to see, man. Because I mean, obviously we've been talking for a long time now, and just to see that kind of escalation of your career. I guess how long ago did you finish your PhD?
2017.
Okay, so. I hadn't started the podcast then, but I think maybe like on Facebook or something. Like I doubt you would have remembered it, but maybe like comments here and there. I certainly knew of you
Oh
before
yeah.
that. But yeah, so to see that, throughout this time, you finish the PhD, do the powerlifting, have your little weightlifting journey there for a little bit, do all this stuff, and now and in Steve Hall too. It's like it's just really cool to see that progression to people of like, hey, this is what I'm doing, and to see it pay off. You know what I mean? So it's just kind of cool, and I figured you'd be a great person to have talk about this.
Well, no, I really appreciate it. Thank you for acknowledging that. And to link it back to the conversation we just had, there are some people who are going to be far more convinced if they see me make progress following a high volume program as to the efficacy of high volume than they would be by a meta regression on 1,000 people from 35 different studies across, 25 lab groups. So I think that's just something we have to accept about human nature, and that's why it's so important to constantly be just, I mean, it doesn't need to be the main thing. Like, I'm not going to start a science, like a philosophy of science channel and lose all my followers except for like the hardcore six, and hopefully you'd be among them.
Yeah.
But I think you do have to sprinkle it in there because that is the default setting of the human mind. If I see it in front of me, if it feels real, versus being this disconnected thing in this study, and I can talk myself into maintaining my biases, or I can be convinced by someone else, then it's not going to be weighted in any kind of logical way. It's going to be weighted based upon vibes, right?
Yep. Yeah, man. So, well, I'm glad we did this. Like I said, hopefully I wasn't too off my game today, but I couldn't flake on my boy Eric here. So we made it happen. Well, actually, this was a pretty long one. I might make this a two-parter just to because we did talk about quite a bit there. But thank you for taking the time as always, my friend.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad you're feeling healthier.
Yes, yeah. So I'm sure, given the 10th appearance today, people know. But where can they find you?
Hey, you can follow me on the Instagram where I'll be dropping those hot 4-minute reels in collaboration with Mass at Helms 3DMJ. And if you really want to get nerdy and learn all about sampling variants, you could subscribe to massresearchreview.com. Trexler just wrote a banger two-parter on how to interpret research design and statistics. And I guarantee you that if you read both of those guides, you are going to be among the people who is able to not feel like you're experiencing whiplash. So yeah, that's for the Uber nerds. And then I'm also working on the third edition, the muscle strength pyramids, which are going to come out, and I am sprinkling in the science communication amongst the here's just what you do in the gym, so that even my less nerdy followers who just want to know like what's the best combination of anecdote and science to do for in the kitchen and in the weight room, you're gonna by osmosis and without it being forced down your throat, you're gonna learn a lot of things as well that'll make you better at sourcing through all this information in the future as well. So that's where you can find me. And if you're really interested in bodybuilding, 3dmusclejourney.com, because that's where we got the coaches who I am the chief science advisor to and do a little bit of coaching on the side myself. So that's all of it.
Awesome. Thanks again, man.
My pleasure.